Brian Shaffer was born on February the 25th, 1979 in Pickerington, Ohio, just outside of Columbus, along with his brother Derek, to parents Randy and Renee. He graduated from his local high school in 1997 before heading over to Ohio State University for some undergraduate work before 6 years later graduating with a degree in microbiology. By 2004, he began studying at the Ohio State College of Medicine, gaining a relationship with another medical student, Alexis Wagoner, before 2 years later, when Brian was only 27 years old, tragedy began to strike. It was 2004 when Brian's mother Renee was diagnosed with myelodysplasia, a form of blood and bone cancer, and by March 2 years later, she would tragically pass away. Brian was extremely close with the woman, and although devastated, those close to him did claim that he dealt with it rather well considering the circumstances. Despite his promising medical career, Brian had a real ambition with music, wanting to start up his own band with Jimmy Buffett as a major influence. By the end of the month, classes were coming to an end, and Brian and Alexis were planning to spend spring break away together in Miami. Shaffer enjoyed this relaxed lifestyle and loved visiting tropical locations, to the point he was actually planning to propose to her on this trip. On Friday, March the 31st, 2006, just 3 days before their planned trip to Miami, classes ended for spring break, so Brian went out for a steak dinner with his father, Randy. He came across as completely exhausted during this entire dinner as he had been pulling all-nighters all week, desperately cramming for some upcoming exams. So although he had planned to go out later that night with his friend William Florence, though most people refer to him as Clint, Randy didn't think that he would go ahead with this plan, though he didn't say anything about it to his son. Brian's brother Derek was also invited to this night out, but he couldn't make it. During this dinner, they actually had a warm father-son heart-to-heart, where Brian told him that he would always be there for him. He informed Randy that he knew that he was feeling low since his wife had passed away, but he promised that he would always be there to support him and that they would get through this difficult time together as a family. At 9 p.m, Brian met Clint at the Ugly Tuna Saloona, a bar in the South Campus Gateway complex on High Street in Columbus, Ohio. Just an hour later, he then made a phone call to his girlfriend Alexis, who was home visiting her family, where they reconfirmed their plans to head to Miami together the following Monday. He ended the call by saying that he loved her, but she didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. Throughout the night, Brian and Clint went from bar to bar, working their way down the arena district, taking shots at each place they stopped. And around midnight, they bumped into Clint's friend Meredith Reed in the Short North bar, who gave them both a ride back to the Ugly Tuna Saloona, where they had started their drinking spree, even joining them for one final round of drinks. Throughout the evening, Brian was in and out of the group constantly, as he was very often described as being extremely sociable. But eventually, he decided to separate from the duo once again, claiming that he was going to go and talk to the band. The band would later claim that Brian never made it to them, and they never spoke with the guy. After a while, Clint and Meredith tried calling him but received no response. CCTV would capture him at 1:55 a.m. talking to two girls before heading back in the direction of the bar. Brian Shaffer would never be seen again. The Ugly Tuna Saloona closed at 2 a.m, so Clint and Meredith waited outside for him, but once the crowd dispersed, there was no sign of Brian Shaffer. They assumed that he just went back to his apartment and didn't tell them, but they, nor his father Randy or girlfriend Alexis, could get a hold of him. Alexis returned to his apartment to find his car still in the drive and nothing misplaced inside the home. There was no sign that he had even returned to go to bed, but she still chose to stay at his apartment all weekend, hoping that he would return home. Unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong, Alexis knew that he would most certainly not miss their trip to Miami, so she still packed and went to the airport, waiting for him. But her heart broke when the plane boarded and left, and Brian was still nowhere to be seen. And this was when he was finally reported missing. Now, this area actually had an extremely high crime rate, which meant that there were a lot of security cameras nearby, including at the entrance to the bar itself, which did show the trio arriving together, as well as Brian speaking to the two girls before heading back in the direction of the bar. But there was absolutely no security camera footage of him leaving. This led investigators to believe that he may have gone back inside and changed clothes, possibly putting on a hat and keeping his head down to hide it from the cameras. One camera would pan across the entire area, while the other one was manually operated, so it is possible that it simply missed him. Columbus had more security cameras than Cleveland, Cincinnati, and Toledo combined. So investigators searched the CCTV of all adjacent and nearby bars and establishments, but there was no sign of Brian, which would have been extremely difficult for him to have avoided every single camera, suggesting that he just didn't leave out of the main entrance. However, the only other exit from the club was a service door that wasn't used by the public. In fact, at the time, it opened up onto a construction site. Not only was nothing found when searched there, nor was he spotted on their own security cameras, but it also would have been extremely difficult to walk through sober, let alone intoxicated. Another theory was that he leapt off the bar's balcony, but this also would have been extremely difficult whilst under the influence. Sniffer dogs were used to search dumpsters in the area, as well as waste containers, but there was nothing, and no particular scent to suggest foul play. Flyers showing his picture were distributed around Ohio. Brian had hazel eyes with brown hair, and a trademark stick figure paying tribute to one of his favourite bands, Pearl Jam, on his upper right arm. He also had a very distinctive fleck in one of his irises, but these flyers all led to no leads. The police were even able to search the local sewage system, and there was nothing. They searched for miles and miles in almost every direction of this bar, and there was no evidence. Brian Shaffer had practically vanished into thin air. Due to the lack of physical evidence left behind, the possibility of foul play or an accidental death was beginning to look less and less likely, especially due to the lack of a body, leading some to believe that the death of his mother may have been too much for him, and he simply ran away to try to grieve, hoping to return one day. Almost every single person who saw him that night agreed to take lie detector tests, all of which passed, including his father Randy and friend Meredith. However, his best friend Clint refused to take one, though it was reported that he was willing to cooperate at first, but was advised against it by his lawyer. On April the 10th, the police actually received a tip that Brian was spotted at a convenience store in Columbus, but once the security camera footage was searched, it was determined that it wasn't him. On April the 19th, a new possible lead arrived when Brian Shaffer's apartment was actually broken into. Alexis was brought in to investigate, hoping that Brian was still alive and simply came back to just get some of his things. Unfortunately, only some DVDs were stolen, and nothing of particular importance to Shaffer, so it was determined that it wasn't connected to his disappearance. His girlfriend Alexis Wagner was understandably completely heartbroken. So much so that she actually made it a habit to, every evening before bed, call his mobile phone, just to hear the sound of his voice, as it almost always went straight to voicemail.
I kept calling it to hear it purely because it was one of the best sounds I have ever heard, even if no one picked up.
She did this every night for 6 months, until finally, in September, it didn't go to voicemail, and the phone actually rang 3 times before disconnecting. Filled with hope, she quickly reported this to the police, and Brian's phone was also pinged by a cell tower in Hilliard, around 14 miles northwest of Columbus. However, Brian's wireless provider actually claimed that this was a technical glitch, and that the phone didn't actually ring. And unfortunately, it would never happen again. As every month went by, more tips were passed on, but most went nowhere. Though at the end of that year in Cincinnati, Pearl Jam lead singer Eddie Vedder would frequently interrupt shows to ask for help regarding the disappearance. There were supposed sightings in Michigan, Texas, and even as far as Sweden. For years, Randy never gave up looking for his son, even visiting a psychic who claimed that Brian's body was in water near a bridge pier. Randy, along with his other son Derek and some locals, bought waders and actually spent their time searching along the shores of Olentangy River, which flows through Columbus to the Ohio State University campuses. They specifically searched along any bridges, but again, nothing was found. At one point, investigators even considered the possibility of Brian being another victim of the smiley face murderer, which involved 45 young men being found dead in bodies of water across several Midwestern American states between the late 90s all the way until the 2010s. However, this would make Shaffer the only victim to have not been found, and there's been no definitive evidence to link him to the serial killer. It wasn't until September 2008 when Ohio was hit with a heavy windstorm. Randy went out into his backyard to clear some debris when tragically the storm blew a nearby tree over, killing him at the age of 55. The neighbours would find the body the next morning. But the story gets even stranger when Randy's obituary was run online with a condolence book being available to the public, when it received a signature stating, "To Dad, love Brian, US Virgin Islands," suggesting that Brian Shaffer was still alive and living elsewhere. Unfortunately, this was investigated, and it turns out that this comment was posted from a public computer in Franklin County and was officially deemed a sick prank. It wasn't until 2009 when the two women who were the last known people to have spoken to Brian were finally identified and questioned. They claimed that he was actually flirting with them, even getting one of their numbers despite being in a relationship and planning an engagement. However, these two were never asked to take a polygraph test, though they were never considered involved in his disappearance. It was now around this time when Brian's friend Clint Florence finally decided to speak out regarding his refusal to take at least 2 polygraph tests all those years earlier. Even during the initial investigation, Clint claimed any and all questions you have for me should be directed to my attorney, Neil Rosenberg. Rosenberg wrote to private investigator Don Corbett and claimed that the police believed Brian was still alive.
If Brian is alive, which is what I'm led to believe after speaking with the detective involved, then it is Brian and not Clint Florence who is causing his family pain and hardship. Brian should come forward and end this. Florence did not have anything to hide. He had merely told everything he knew from the beginning and did not see the value of doing so again.
Clint and his attorney maintained that they believe Brian isn't dead. But despite Clint and his attorney's words, Corbett was unable to locate the investigator that they're referring to who claimed that Brian is most likely alive. And Clint and his attorney both refused to elaborate. However, this wasn't received well. Many who were close with Brian decided to cut ties with Clint for his constant refusal to aid in the investigation. Most, including Brian's brother Derek, believe that he is fully aware of what happened that night.
As soon as the detective started getting involved, that's when he pretty much had no contact with anybody. I've always thought he definitely knows something, just won't come forward with it. If Brian did take off somewhere, if that is the case, we just always had a strong feeling that Clint would possibly know that.
It has also been reported that Brian and Clint actually had an argument that night, leading some to believe that he was involved in the disappearance. Alexis also believes that Clint is withholding information, though she thinks that Brian is most likely dead and doesn't believe he would have run away to start a whole new life.
Something just seemed off with Clint. The way he talked about my brother after he went missing, kind of in a negative way. I wouldn't expect that from someone whose friend vanished. I deserve to know any information Florence might have about Brian's disappearance.
However, some dispute this, as Clint was actually with Meredith for the majority of the night and she passed her polygraph test. So there's no way that he could have been involved without her also being complicit. By 2014, the police were still receiving at least 2 tips a month, but none of them ever led to any useful information. Though investigator Andre Edwards claimed, "I can say with 100% certainty that Shaffer did not leave via that escalator." Every single person who was recorded on the CCTV footage was later identified, ruling out the possibility that Brian had changed clothes and hidden, especially considering his easily distinguishable tattoo and the fact that he was 6'2" and weighed 165 pounds. In 2018, the Ugly Tuna Saloona finally closed its doors, leaving the mystery of Brian Shaffer to continue to linger. It wasn't until 2019 when an image of an American homeless man in Tijuana was released online, as he bore a strong resemblance to Brian Shaffer. This was even forwarded onto detectives who were in charge of the case in 2020. But after they used facial recognition analysis, they concluded that it was not Brian Shaffer. By March 2021, age progression images were released to the public, but the main opinion continues to be split. His family and close friends have maintained that he had no reason to run away and start a new life, especially as he was planning an engagement on a trip that was gifted to him by his own mother. Renee was a nurse and the inspiration of Brian attending medical school, so most believe that it became too much and he ran away out of grief. But to this day, there's been no activity on his mobile phone or bank account since that night. However, on one occasion, Brian did actually ask Alexis to run away with him, though she wasn't sure if he was joking or not, and the matter was soon dropped. However, a week passed before he told her that she should move on and find someone else because he was in a dark place emotionally. But Alexis refused to leave him and they continued to plan their trip to Miami anyway. A theory is that he was depressed and took his own life. He was supposedly tens of thousands of dollars in debt from undergrad and medical school, and he was a full-time student and worked part-time in a department store, making it extremely difficult to have faked a new identity and fled the country to start a new life. And if he committed suicide, there's still no body to confirm this. Allegedly, there was also tension between Randy and his two sons over the share of Renee's life insurance policy, as their father believed they were receiving more money than they actually should be. Renee had supported Brian financially while he was attending college, and it was suggested that Randy was going to cut him off, though this has never been officially confirmed. Some have even thrown accusations towards the Ugly Tuna Saloona staff themselves for being involved. Upon further investigation, Sergeant John Hurst believed that there was a point in the security footage where there seems to be a jump cut, suggesting that somebody had overwritten it to hide something. However, he did confess that there was an employee stationed at the emergency exit that night, and that nobody had attempted to use it. Alexis went on to marry and have children, and though she continues to publicly speak about Brian in hopes to help the case, she has come to terms with it and has moved on. While Derek, the only remaining relative, continues seeking answers. Hello guys, this is Rob from Seeking Answers. I really hope you enjoyed that episode. If you do want to see more, please consider donating to Patreon or clicking that join button below to become a channel member. Unfortunately, YouTube's monetization doesn't really cater to the content that we make, so we do need all the help that we can get. I also realise that not everyone is able to give a monthly payment, so there is now a PayPal link in the description if anyone does want to donate a one-off payment. Doesn't matter the amount, any amount is appreciated. And if you do a one-off payment, you'll be able to request a case for us to cover, and it will really go towards helping the channel out and continuing to grow the community. Any amount is appreciated and it will go towards keeping this channel alive and making more content, going on location more. You will get perks in exchange and you will help really give this channel the boost it needs. Thank you for all of your support and tune in next week for another video.